We've had amazing success with our steelhead schools over the last few years. From the Great Lakes to the Skeena, we have fished with some of the best guides that are out there in the country. In the past, we've called this Steelhead East or Steelhead West. And in this episode, we're just going to call it the Steelhead School. I have Jeff Liskay, our Great Lakes podcast host, and Brian Niska, our West Coast Skeena Spey Lodge host. And today, you're going to get some of the best tips you can have for steelhead so you have a better shot at some action this year. This is the Wet Fly Swing podcast where I show you the best places to travel to for fly fishing, how to find the best resources and tools to prepare for that big trip, and what you can do to give back to the fish species we all love. Hey, how's it going? I'm Dave, host of the Wet Fly Swing podcast. I've been fly fishing since I was a little kid. I grew up around a little fly shop and have created one of the largest fly fishing podcasts in this country. I've also interviewed more of the greatest fly anglers and outfitters than just about anyone out there. Brian Niska and Jeff Liskay are on the podcast today to walk you through the Skeena Spey School and what you can expect if you're planning on fishing this big river, a big West Coast steelhead river this year. You're going to find out how to find fish by looking upstream and why this is a key. You're going to find out how to hold your fly in the bucket longer and some of the best rods and lines you need for the West Coast and the Great Lakes and beyond. Plus, you're going to get the top 4 criteria for finding fish on any steelhead water. We're heading back to the Skeena this year. Let's find out what we have new in store for you right now. Here we go. Jeff Liskay and Brian Niska. How you guys doing?
Awesome, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Doing great.
Yeah, this is really cool, you guys. I think that, man, I go back. I'm not sure when we first started these podcast series, right? But we got the, Great Lakes Dude podcast. We got In the Bucket. I've got 2 hosts. I mean, I'll just start here because when I first interviewed both of you guys, both of the episodes were like off the charts. I got feedback from people right away. As I was listening, you probably know that when you're listening to something, they're saying all these detailed information. You're just like, whoa, man, you're blowing my mind. That's what you guys did when I had episodes with both of you. So I'll just start there. I feel like this is pretty amazing bringing you both on, but let's go back to this trip. So we got this Skeena trip that we're doing. This is the other unique thing what we have doing. We've also been doing the Great Lakes, Steelhead School, the East Coast thing. We've been doing, Brian, with you, the West Coast Steelhead School. This year, we're bringing together both schools, essentially. And Jeff, you're going to be heading out to the Skeena, to the lodge at Brian's lodge, and you're going to be there with some people that are out there to fish and find steelhead. So maybe, Jeff, let's start with you. How do you feel about this? You fished the Skeena before. What's your feeling? What do you think this trip's going to be like out there?
I am so stoked to meet Brian, be at his lodge, and then be on the Skeena. What's really good, Dave, about these schools is that when you immerse yourself with some of the most fishiest steelhead guides, and Brian and myself, 365 days a year, fly fishing comes into our world. So when you immerse yourself with that, you can't help but get better. And then, of course, you just learn from every aspects of it. You catch a few fish, and the camaraderie is off the chart. So I'm just super excited. There's no place like the Skeena. Just to go on record, there is no place like the Skeena.
Yep, well put. And Brian, what about you? You live on the Skeena. I mean, what does it feel like? What does this event feel like for you? I feel like for a lot of people who are going to be involved, it's going to blow them away. You do this every day. What's so special? Why is the Skeena this amazing place that people travel across the world to get to?
Yeah, I think the Skeena represents a unique opportunity to encounter, steelhead while they're fresh before they've been affected by people. What I mean by that is if you fish further up the system on some of the tributaries, then you're dealing with fish that maybe been caught before. Definitely seen some flies. And, here we catch fish in ridiculously shallow water. And you truly learn that steelhead don't care too much about your fly color. They care about how it's presented. And the big thing I would say down here is the opportunity to connect with a fish that could be the best fish of your life. We don't tend to hit huge numbers of fish, but we get some real memorable ones. And we get them in this scenario where you're hooking fish in 2.5 feet of water and the river's, 250 yards wide or whatever. So you truly can see what the fish are capable of. And it also is a scenario where you have the chance at landing these fish because the runs are really long. So it's not like the fish is going to go out into a rapid and spool you and you'll never see it again. You can move down the run and have a chance. And, you think of some of the hugest steelhead you could imagine that are going to places like the Kispiox and the Babine. And in the last episode of In the Bucket that we did, I had Bob Hooton on. And Bob, of course, is pretty well-known BC conservationist, but also a really serious angler. And I said to him, I said, Bob, what's the biggest steelhead that's come out of the Skeena? What do you think? And he narrowed it down to one specific fish. And this fish, I'm not going to say it's 50 pounds, but it's all of 45 probably. And, Jeff, to think of what it might be like to connect with a fish like that down here in the scenario that I just described, I don't think we'd stand a chance to land it, but what a memory that would be. And if you're asking when that happened, that was in the mid-70s. So there.
So, Jeff, what is the biggest steelhead that you've seen out there? I'm not sure whether you caught it or you've been around it.
Right close to 30 pounds.
Oh, wow.
Yep. So,
holy cow.
You're one cast away and one rock away from a fish of a lifetime. It could happen your first cast when you step in the Skeena. It could literally happen on the last run, the last 10 casts. It could happen. That's what's, it's just, you're mining for silver, right? It's just unbelievable.
Yeah. And the time that we're, just as we lay this out, we're going to be there in, the cool thing is we're kicking off a giveaway here this week for some lucky winners going to get a chance to go up with the crew who's going up there. But the trip's going to be late August, right, Brian? We're going to be in there. Maybe talk about that, this timing of late August. Why is that such a, and I was up there a couple of years ago in late August and it was amazing, right? The conditions were great. But why is that such a good time to hit the river?
You bet. So our season here starts mid-July and goes through till the end of October. Most folks want to be here sometime in late August, early September, because this is, close to the peak of the run. But there's something magical that happens at the beginning of September as well. And that is as the water temperature drops a bit, the fish start to sit in the runs more. The fish we're catching in July and early August, pretty much 100% moving fish. So we're trying to find places to ambush them, places they need to stop and take a break. Once we get into September, the fish start to sit in the runs a bit more. So, even if there were less fish around, sometimes our catch rates can be higher. And I think it's just that really neat transition time because, you can still feels a lot like summer during the day, but you got a hint of fall in the air. The leaves will have started to turn, crispy mornings, a little bit of mist on the water, which of course the Skeena is named for. So I think it's a great time. And by the way, Dave, I think our previous trip up here was the 3rd week of August. So we pushed it back. We pushed it back just a little bit this time. And I think it's a solid move.
Yeah, good. Okay. And then Jeff, you have some experience, right? You've been up to the Skeena. Do you typically... Are you going, have you been there different times of the season? Because I know when I first went to the Skeena back in the quite a bit ago, I think it was the 2010 range, we were there late in the season. So it was like September. I think we left in October when snow started to fall, right? So, but are you pretty familiar with the Skeena and different times of fishing it, or do you typically go like August?
I started out on the Skeena in the spring fishery. And then, of course, like everybody else, I started going up there that 2nd, 3rd week of September, because that's like peak for the tributaries, like Brian said. But then I realized that to really achieve, like Brian says, that magical fish that's coming out of the ocean and take advantage of these fish that are migrating up sometimes, hundreds of kilometers upriver, you want to go earlier. Because if you go the later you go, these fish, they're holding a little bit, but they have a mission, right? If they're heading to the Babine, they could come up through there right about when we're talking about, so it's going to be, I think it's like the perfect week. Like I'm super stoked.
Nice. And just to lay that out a little bit, we're going to be there 4 nights for the most part. I think the crew that's going to be there 4 nights. We're going to be there 3.5 days on the water. And then Jeff, you'll be there. That's a cool thing. Brian, you'll be there as well. You're basically obviously running the operation, but Jeff, you're going to be there to do some fishing, hang out with the people there. Is that how do you see this thing laying out with you? Because I'm not going to be there. You're going to be there. Like, how's it look to you?
Well, I'm the head cheerleader with the guides, and Brian's going to be the head cheerleader at the lodge. And between his awesome guides, who I know, I think it's a win-win situation. I'm going to be taking some really cool, badass photos of you catching some fish. We're going to work on some casting. We're going to have some adult beverages in the evening. You can't help but not have fun and learn. And it's a check your box. If you haven't been, this is one of these trips that you check your box. Brian is an accomplished, certified two-handed caster. So I'm super excited with him. His guides you can't win. I mean, you can't beat it.
Yeah, no, it's good. And that's how I see this playing out is that, and I think you are going to be doing some fishing because I think that's the cool thing. But I've heard when we've done our trip to the Great Lakes, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit here, I mean, that blew me away because I wasn't expecting so much action. And our conditions weren't perfect, right, when we did our trips up there, but we had a lot of action. But everybody said, and I knew this from the square one about you as a guide, you're just like you just do more work. It seems like you're working 24/7. You're making sure everybody has this amazing experience. So yeah, how did you get to that point with your guiding where you got to where you are? Like, did that come from mentorship or did you just kind of learn that over the years?
I think I put myself in the client's position. And, a lot of times anglers don't have as much time as Brian and I do to spend on the water. This is a special moment for them. It could be one day, it could be the whole week, but I just treat them like I would want to be treated. Like if I know there's a fish in the run, we're going to work to get that fish. We're going to talk it through. That rod is in my hand, but I'm speaking through his mobility to make that happen. What's interesting about a guide is that we're the fabric that holds us together, right? Between the fish. So the guide, it's that intertwined of communication, and then the fish is just a bonus, but that's the next layer of the connection is once we connect with the fish with our communication. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, you're living vicariously, right, through your client.
Yeah, like Edward Few when we were on the Elk Creek that day.
Oh yeah, Ed Few. Yeah, the bamboo rod, silk line, horsehair leader, traditional fly. I mean, it was, yeah. Ed, we still talk about it. In fact, I even brought Ed on the podcast. We did an episode just to, highlight that. But yeah, this is great. And the Great Lakes, I do want to touch on that today because the Skeena is, I mean, I feel like totally different, right, than what you're fishing up in the Great Lakes. Is there some overlap between and I know, Brian, you haven't necessarily been on fish the Great Lakes yet, but I know you've interviewed some people out there. But from your perspective, Jeff, is there quite a bit of overlap? The things you do in the Great Lakes, do they transition over to the Skeena for steelhead?
Absolutely. Brian hit the nail on the head. You have to fish the fly, right? I mean, I'm not really a color type. I might have 2-3 different colors because of our waters blows out sort of just like the Skeena systems do very easily with snow melt or whatever. But I think fishing the fly and understanding how to fish that fly properly, that's going to be a real bonus, when you come up, with Brian and I and his guides. I think you'll learn a ton, but so much goes into the water temperature, sort of knowing where the ground zero spot is, how to marinate it in certain areas. And I would say, Dave, you were there. I mean, I think you would notice it's more technical swinging. It's off of a ledge that you got to step it in there and.
Yeah. I learned a ton from you in the Great, and I fished my whole life. That's the cool thing about just fishing in general, but especially steelhead. You're always learning, and I learned a ton that first trip. And then, and now we're back. So we're going back to the Skeena. So Brian, turning back to you on this, I know you haven't been to the Great Lakes, but have you had a number of people from the Great Lakes fish at your lodge? Have you talked to some folks that have come out from the east side?
Oh yeah, there's great anglers from the Great Lakes fisheries. And I've listened to some of the shows you've done, Jeff, and listening to you talk about the use of sink tips and how you change sink tips and different presentations, I was immediately thinking you'll do well here with our moving fish, because what we're trying to do is find places where they need to slow down. And what that means is we're looking for the transition zones. We're looking for the obstacles, the bigger rocks, the places where the fish have to make a lateral move. And our anglers that are able to fish proximity to these obstructions, rocks, and keep their fly moving close to the bottom tend to outfish folks that just blindly cast and step. So, your technical ability from the Great Lakes and your knowledge of different sink tips and presentations, I think, are going to really work in your favor with our fishery here on the lower Skeena, where we try and find the biggest rocks that we can. And a lot of times, we're fishing motips that are 2.5 feet of sink of, say, T14 or T11, and maybe a lightly weighted fly, and we're in 2.5 feet of water, but we're really trying to be, 6-7 inches off the bottom, and we're swinging the fly. But at the same time, we often, almost always have a raised rod position because we're trying to work hard to slow the fly. And I think, just based on what I've heard you say on other shows, I think that this is really going to work out well.
Yeah. Hey, Brian, let me ask you a question. So do you traditionally have, if you're stepping through a run with the two anglers, do you usually have one use a less aggressive wade line with a lighter, say, intermediate, and then the next angler step out a little bit to cover those bigger nuggets with a little heavier tip? Or what's the skinny and how do you approach the lower Skeena?
Yeah. So if I'm guiding, which doesn't happen as often as it used to, but if I'm actually guiding, What I tend to do is present the run and then break it down and say, hey, okay, well, here's the features. And we're looking for the features. And a feature in this case could be a bit of a diagonal bar. It could be a cluster of rocks. And of course, clusters of rocks attract other clusters of rocks as the river's high and it's moving big boulders. Anywhere that we have a little point or a scallop bay that suggests that there's some variation to the depth, and the fish have to make a choice. Am I going left? Am I going right? Do I have to push out into the heavier current? But I don't really love the speed there. So I'm going to tuck back in. So what I do with my folks is I don't tend to get them to fish one after the other. I kind of give them their own section, but then I take the one that fished, say, the top section, and I bring them through the bottom, but really highlight those same features. And then I obviously flip it around for the person that fished the lower bit. So I don't tend to say, okay, take 2 steps and cast, take 2 steps and cast. I tend to say, okay, here's this feature. And as you approach this feature, I want you to fish the top of it. Then I want you to fish the inside. Then we're going to hang it over the outside. Then we're going to tuck it in the back. And this could involve changing flies or sink tips. And when I say changing flies, I'm not necessarily concerned about trying a different color. I'm more of, hey, okay, I think I need a bigger profile here. I think I need some weight. I want something light and lively in this flat bit here. So, to not be a lazy fishing guide for us involves a lot of changing of sink tips and sometimes flies. So that's my approach. And I tend to, work under this theory that throughout the run, there's only a few key spots where the fish are going to want to hang out for long periods of time. And you're foolish if you just cast and step through those spots. You want to really work those spots well. So that's my philosophy, Jeff. And whether it works for other people, I don't know, but it's something that I've always done here, since we started the lodge. And I feel like I've learned some stuff from it. I'll tell you one more thing. I've got a great group of guides that works for us. And probably the queen bee of the bunch is, of course, Adrian Como. And I've got a show coming out that I just did with Adrian and Simon Gosworth. And for folks listening, you need to find that episode if you're coming to the Skeena, because Adrian does a really great pep talk in there about how to set yourself up for success targeting these moving fish. And of course, she's not just talking about the Skeena. She's got experience on the Dean and the Lower Squamish. And, she also talks a little bit about the philosophy. I tend to view my role as a guide as that of a coach, a motivational speaker, perhaps. And my job is to keep the person's fly in the water doing what it's supposed to and, keep them engaged. And Adrian's got a great quote in that show where she says, sometimes you just need to take a break. Sometimes you need to go home just for your own mental health and get a reset. And I think that's important. And as a guide, sometimes I do this. I might pull a guy back for a cup of coffee, change his fly, not because I think that last one didn't work, but I want him to have a fresh start or her to have a fresh start. And, that's the job of a guide. Keep them in the water, keep them fishing. And if we don't catch fish, we want to feel that we didn't catch fish because there wasn't a taker in the pool.
Stonefly nets, nestled in the heart of the Ozarks, Ethan, a master craftsman, dedicates his skill to creating the finest wood landing nets. Stonefly nets are more than just nets. They are part of our story, each cast and every cast. Ready to make your fly fishing trips unforgettable? Visit stoneflynets.com and discover the difference of a handcrafted wood landing net. Yeah, the catching fish is kind of a interesting part with steelhead, right? Because I've had this a number of times, and you don't always catch fish. Sometimes you get skunked. I think when I had Marty and Mia on back quite a while ago, I asked Mia, we were talking about this. I said something stupid like, "Gosh, have you ever been skunked or something like that?" And she laughed. She's like, "Of course. I mean, everybody has, right? Even the greatest guides in the world, right, have been skunked because it's steelhead fishing." But I feel like, you've got that one chance. So how do you give yourself a little bit better chance to hook that fish? I think that's the struggle with steelhead, especially people that are newer to it, like with not enough experience. I just talked to somebody, in fact, in our group who just went down to the Southern Oregon and caught his first steelhead. He hooked up with somebody else. Actually, Brian, he hooked up with Ray, who's been up to your lodge. And Ray connected. We have a little community going now, and he hooked up with Ray through our community. And they went down there and fished the... I think it was the Rogue, and he just caught his first steelhead, and it was not a giant fish, but it was a steelhead, and it was just this amazing thing to hear, right? Like it's a game, and that's why I told him, I said, man, that's a game changer. You just got your first steelhead. Now one thing that works. Do you guys feel like once you kind of get a steelhead, like you've probably seen lots of people get their first steelhead, what does that mean? Maybe Jeff will go to you. What does that mean? You've seen that a lot to people. Do you think that's a big point when maybe they do something? Does that change the game for them?
It really does. When they commit to a swung fly and most of the time they've already caught, maybe for me, they probably have already caught and landed a Great Lakes steelhead, but it's their first fish on a swung fly. It's pretty, you might have a few trout sets going on, and halfway through the day, number 3, and I'm back there praying myself. But when it all goes down, you could just see like everything has changed. Like you could see that I'm probably never going to put an indicator on again. It's like, was it really hard? Was it super like, did I screw up? But I just had that actually when Nicole Lewis came in, we
Oh
had
yeah,
somebody.
Nicole.
Yep. So he brought a gentleman in, and he was like first one in Great Lakes swung fly, and he couple misses at first, and my teeth were sort of like, okay. And I says, no worries, we're going to make this happen. And number 3, boom, in the bag. So I think it's a self-accomplishment, right? Because once you go down the rabbit hole, I mean, I've been weeks without a grab.
Yeah.
So you got to have them in the system, and you got to have them a little slightly grabby to catch one of those silly things, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's interesting because I know, Brian, you've talked about this too on your show with, run numbers, right? Ups and downs. And it's kind of like the Great Lake. And you talked about that episode, I think, with Brian and John. You guys all talked about the fact that there's a lot of fish. I can't remember the numbers, but the Great Lakes has lots of fish. And the West Coast right now has been having ups and downs. Sometimes you hear these really super negative things, and then sometimes you hear stories that are actually not as bad as you know what I mean? But what's your take on it, Brian? You got your hand on the pulse. You had Bob Hooton on. What was the take home from Bob and everybody there as far as where we're at with steelhead and where it's going?
Yeah, I think the variability has been there, since anyone's been paying attention. On that show, Bob highlighted the early 90s as a period of low abundance, and not entirely different than, a few years back, 2021, I think, when we had one of the lowest guesstimate of Skeena steelhead. So, this natural variability, I think, is something that didn't freak people out in the past because information didn't travel the way it does now, right? Now everybody checks the Tyee test fishery every morning when they wake up. And here's the other thing too. I'm not trying to get too political on you, and feel free to edit this out if you like. But we've got this ecosystem right now where the NGOs are a little bit out of control. And what I mean by that, and I'm not going to use name specific groups, but the crisis narrative tends to create opportunity because then the government says, okay, oh my gosh, there's a salmon crisis. We need to spend $250 million. And the various NGOs say, oh, well, hey, well, we can do stuff with that. And the evidence here is if you look at the staffing and the payroll of these various groups over the last decade, you've seen them go up substantially. And in order to keep that rolling, the crisis narrative needs to stay in the news. Now, the flip side of this, I don't love either. So this year, the Skeena had a pretty decent return, slightly better than the historical average. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. Slightly better than the historical average. And I heard all sorts of silly talk about record runs and this or that. So the hype is bad because what the hype does is it creates expectation, and it brings people out of the woodwork who maybe aren't real steelheaders. And I'm not trying to be critical, but there's a certain mentality of a steelheader, and that mentality is what Jeff described. I'm going to go fishing for 4 or 5 days and not get a bite, and I'm cool with that because I love the process. But if I hear that there's a record run, I think I'm going to get a bunch, even though I haven't put the work in. And when a bunch of people show up at the same time to fish, I don't care where you are, your chances of catching a fish go down. That episode that we've referred to a couple of times, which I actually am quite proud of, the Hooten one with John and Brian, and the part I'm proud of is I did a better job of shutting up and letting those guys talk. And Brian, who's a quiet, brilliant dude from the Great Lakes, from the Ontario side, he goes on to explain the relationship between numbers of anglers, numbers of fish, and quality fishing. And I'll summarize it like this. When you have a lot of fish and a lot of anglers, it doesn't necessarily equal a quality experience. If you have less fish and a decent number of anglers, a similar number of fish can be caught. So, what is the measure of a good day? Is it fish in the net, or, is it an uncrowded river to yourself? I don't know. That's a personal thing. But, for me at least, I love the feeling of presenting a fly to a fish that I don't believe's seen a fly yet. And that's the unique opportunity we have down here. my family, or my wife's family, my family now, is from Ontario. So I'm pretty sure at some point I'll get my chance at some Great Lakes steelhead fishing, and I'm
Right.
going to look forward to that. But, in the meantime, I come from a place where we're used to working hard for the fish, not because the fish is hard to catch, just because there's not that many of them and there's a lot of places to fish. So, my home water growing up was the Thompson and the Squamish, relatively low returns for the size of the river. You put a lot of sweat equity into whatever positive feedback you get from fish. So the mentality of a steelheader is so important. And that's the mentality of, hey, like you said, Jeff, is a great quote. I'm not going to try and rehash it because I'll butcher it, but something about, just one more cast, right? One more cast, one more rock. Let's keep it going. Let's see what's out there. And that's this natural curiosity that I think is consistent among people that love to steelhead. And, the truth of the matter is not everybody that fish has that, right?
Yeah.
Dave, what did you think for your first time when you come to Terrace, and it's a pretty industrialized area, and then within the first 5 minutes of a jet boat ride and you start heading towards the ocean, wasn't it a dramatic, eye-opening experience?
Oh, it was. I was just going to say that. I kind of had that there as a note. The fact that I don't remember seeing anybody fishing, Brian, when we were with you. I mean, we must have. I mean, I think there were some people. I guess there were people fishing, but it just felt like the river's gigantic and you're floating down. I know one time we went downriver with one of your guides, Brian, and we went through the canyon section and we were stopped on this bar, this island. I mean, it felt like we were in the middle of Alaska, nowhere. I mean, we are. I mean, it is Canada, right? I mean, there's not a lot of people up there, but it's cool because Terrace is right there. You hop off the plane and you go for it. So it's the Skeena is, I'm not sure the CFS, Brian, you probably know some of that, but it's a massive river. How do you describe the Skeena to somebody who's heading up there, if somebody's thinking about it?
Well, I think one of the neat selling features for this part of the world, regardless of whether you're going to visit here as a tourist for a week or consider moving here, is the fact that if you drive 15 minutes in any direction, you really feel like you have the place to yourself. And at the same time, it's a relatively easy place to get to. We have a modern airport, a lot of amenities in town if we need them. But, our lodge is only 15 minutes from the airport and you still have Wi-Fi here. Our culinary team works some real magic. And part of that is the fact that they're able to go to town and get stuff fresh on an almost daily basis. The folks that run these really remote lodges, my hat goes off to them because what a logistical challenge it must be to ensure that you always have enough of everything that you need when you're dealing with helicopter flights and planes. And we have it so easy here because we're fairly close to town, yet, when you're at the lodge and, you can hear the wolves howl or you watch a moose swim across the river, you feel like you're out in the middle of nowhere, but the reality is it's a really easy place to get in and out of.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited about this trip, and I think let's get into maybe a couple more tips. You guys, we got these episodes, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Brian, on the episode that we have coming. We'll put some of those in the show notes from past because you guys dug into a lot on steelhead. But let's just leave some people who are listening now, maybe that might be going on this trip. We're going to have some open spots here that people want to pay for some of these spots, but let's just break down 2 or 3 tips. So we're going to be fishing the Skeena. Day one, well, we're going to have probably 3.5 days, right, Brian, out there, but people are going to get there, get off the plane. You're going to drive them up. I think people are going to be fishing maybe even the first day, evening. But Brian, let's start with you. What are you telling people? They're fired up. They're excited. What are you telling them to get them ready to maybe hook up, find a fish or two, and get some action?
I have to say, Dave, this is one of my favorite parts of the job. Obviously, I'm a guy who sells the trips, so I have a lot of pre-contact with people, and I love the planning process.
Yeah, and you pick them up, right? That's a cool thing. When we were there, you drove. I know it wasn't you. It was who was it? Somebody, but you were there to greet, right? I can't remember.
I do a lot of the airport pickups. So the way
you do.
Yeah. The way the day will work is, as I said, Terrace is pretty easy to get in and out of. So we have 2 major airlines that offer multiple flights a day here. Ideally, guests will arrive around 10 a.m. We'll pick them up at the airport, bring them out to the lodge, feed them lunch, and get them on the water. So we should be fishing by 1 o'clock, no problem. So it's going to be a solid half day that first afternoon with the intention of getting everybody to the point where they can fish effectively as quick as possible. From a gear standpoint, what I tend to encourage people to do, because a lot of times folks, maybe they pull up Google Earth or they look at some of our photos, they say, man, that river's big. I'm going to bring my 14-footer. I want to bring my 15-footer. Well, sure, but that's kind of like, it's a specialty item. What you really want out here is a a 12 to 13 foot rod with a Skagit head or a Scandi head, if that's your preference. And you really want to do a good job of fishing a 65-foot cast. Occasionally we catch fish further out, but I think what I try and coach people, and I'll do this when I pick them up from the airport on the way to the lodge, I'll say, hey, every cast fishes. You got to believe, wade shallow, cast short, and anything suspicious has to be a fish. And what I mean by that is weird bump, that's a steelhead. Slight hesitation, that's a steelhead. Water did something weird behind your fly, obviously a steelhead. That's the mentality of a steelheader. Sometimes we get it wrong and it's a bull trout, but you have to believe that because sometimes fish will show interest in your fly without taking it. And if you believe that that's a fish and you repeat the cast, sometimes that will be a fish. So that mentality of optimism and confidence and believing in what you're using. And so to that end, a lot of times I'll say to people, hey, what's your favorite fly? What fly do you have confidence in? Let's start there. Because I already got stuff that I'm confident in. And we can put mine on when you lose confidence, but let's try your stuff first and see how it goes. Maybe that's slightly different than what most guides do, but that's just a personal thing I like to do.
Yeah, perfect. You remind me, as you talked about, it's the tip and the tap and all that stuff. And when I was there, I had a fish on that I landed and I played and landed. And actually, Adrian, she got me into the fish. I was up the top of the run and I landed that thing. And until I got into my hand and saw it, and even then, I thought it was a steelhead, but it was a bright, super bright coho. And I had, that's something because I haven't caught many coho, at least chrome bright coho. Is that something, Brian, for you that you guys, for me, I thought that was amazing. I've caught plenty of steelhead. Obviously, people are there for the steelhead, but that was really a unique experience, the coho. Is that something that it happens quite often up there? I guess it depends on the run and the timing.
It varies from year to year. So this past year, we caught way more steelhead than coho. The year before, probably caught slightly more coho, or at least 50-50 coho and steelhead. And same flies, same presentation. And these aren't your slough coho or your Alaska creekmouth side channel coho. These are like hardcore moving fish that will hammer your fly and take off with it. And I'll say that the coho often will hit the fly harder than the steelhead. And the big northerns, which is what, the coho up here are famous for, they got the big golf ball nose and, the Chinook salmon body. Those things will put up such a battle when you hook them that you'll be convinced you have a trophy steelhead on. And then you see it, you go, oh, it's a coho. Wow. And I think part of that is just the fact that these are fish that are traveling up the system quite a ways in a lot of cases. And there's a funny thing too with those coho I'll mention. The biggest coho that we catch, we tend to catch further out. I don't know if this translates for steelhead as well, because we've caught some big steelhead real close to shore. But a lot of times when we hook a big coho, something, 14, 15 pounds or above, we're getting it on, early in the swing on a longer type cast. So yeah, it's kind of fun, keeps it interesting. And obviously the Skeena is a giant fish highway. You never know what you're going to catch. And, in August, everything's swimming by, but obviously our focus is going to be steelhead. And hopefully we catch some nice coho too, because you're right, they're beautiful fish.
Yeah, good. And Jeff, what about for you? If we got this trip going, you've been on the Skeena before, just in your steelhead background, what are you telling somebody listening now who maybe is going to be fishing the Skeena and they want to get some action this season?
I think we could have a $1,500 rod, an $800 click and paw badass reel, but your eyes are your best tools. And when you step into the Skeena, first thing is you let that fly go right to the beach. You'll be really, really amazed that how, like on the dangle in a foot of water, that you could get a fish of a lifetime. So that's tip one.
Great tip.
Tip two is when you're working down a run, because you're splitting the runs up, or you're going to fish ground zero, Brian might rotate you out. But I think really what set me aside and I started catching more fish consistently was as you're working through a run, your fishy senses, if you see the fly sort of just pushing through with, like Brian said, no couchy water, or it's not slowing down, in a little, a greasy spot, push through that area faster. But boy, when you get into that area you see that fly going, moving, swinging fast, and all of a sudden it starts to park, make multiple casts at different angles, put it in their tail first with a big pullback mend, go ahead there and race one through there with the big broadside, but make multiple casts, because the good thing about, compared to my little neck of the woods, we got these small runoff rivers, as you know, if you slow down, you're pretty much poaching the water for the next angler. Where on the Skeena, there's more water than you can imagine. So feel free to really work those juicy spots when you find them.
That's awesome. That's a great tip. And on that thing, talking about that, you got that little broken. There's something going on there. How do you guys? Is there a problem getting the swing, or do you typically let it swing through, let it do its thing? Or are you doing things with the rod, with your hand, trying to get it to fish right? But talk about that, because I know some runs you fish that maybe it feels like it's bending your line. Maybe there's slack in your line as it's swinging through. I know everything's different, but what would be your tip on that? Maybe Jeff, you know what I'm saying here? When you you're talking about that there's a broken something going on. How do you work that water?
So a lot of times I always try to say that I'm the fly. And so if I've got a really big nugget, right, people think those fish lay behind the nugget. They actually lay in front and beside the nugget. So, that little depression. So a lot of times as I'm getting there, I'll just creep my way down a little bit with my wade and just let those materials undulate a little bit. And then I'll just if you put the rod to the middle of the river, it'll slow it down and just park it right in there as long as you can. And then the next cast, I might come through there, throw a big, get it nice tail first, but then put a little downstream med and let it hook through there really quickly. So there's all different ways to play the game, but like one rock, there's a rock that I've fished on the Morice every time I've been up, and it's what I call reload spot. If there's a fish moving through it parks on that rock. And I'm sure Brian knows lots of those reload spots, I'm sure.
Yeah. That is interesting, because the Morice, the Bulkley, the Babine, the Kispiox, all these rivers upriver, all these, tributaries, right, to the Skeena. Brian, are you familiar with, you're on the Skeena. I know your lodge is on the lower river. Have you fished the entire river? Do you think the lower river, it fishes a lot differently than some of those upper rivers, the Morice, et cetera?
Yeah, I have not fished every tributary. That's important for me to make clear. I have a lot of experience on the Bulkley, fished the Morice a bunch, fished the Kispiox a bit, fished the Babine a bit, and then a bunch of smaller rivers, especially everything down here. Some of the more remote tributaries I have not been to. But there's difference between moving fish and fish that are going to hang out. And obviously fish have to move through everywhere. So I'm going to take us to the Bulkley for a second, even though that's not where we're going to be fishing. The lower Bulkley is vastly different than the top of the Bulkley. Now, the Morice and the Bulkley are essentially the same river. Okay. The top end of the Bulkley that comes into to meet the Morice there is smaller than the actual Morice flow, but it takes the name of the Bulkley from there, that point down. When you move into the lower part of the Bulkley, where there's a lot of canyon water, moving fish that are going to hang out for periods of time, the approach changes. To me, it's a more interesting fish because you have to pay attention to what you're doing. And I love that tip Jeff just gave about, parking the fly and other times moving it through quickly, because fish want to see different stuff. And this idea that we're going to make one cast and take 2 or 3 steps and move on and we've covered the water is hilarious. But you see a lot of anglers doing that. They're just working their way through, encountering fish in spite of themselves. And I think that, my own personal experience, the friends that I have who grew up gear fishing, especially ones that fished a spoon. And by fishing a spoon, I don't mean casting it out and cranking it back. I mean swinging it like we do. Those folks become very quickly exceptional fly anglers. Maybe they don't have the prettiest casts right away, but it doesn't matter. They know how to swim the fly. And what you just said there, Jeff, that was pretty cool. Like about picturing yourself as the fly. I like that. I'm going to steal that at some point. That's good stuff. But, hey, the lower Skeena fishery down here, the mental challenge of it is there's not always a fish in front of you. The further up the system you go, you can probably find a fish that's going to be hanging out. But that fish may have been caught before, may have been caught multiple times. It's definitely seen some stuff. Whereas down here, you just have to have this mental attitude that you believe what you're doing is going to work. And you're going to keep doing it. And eventually when there's a fish there, you're going to get this positive reinforcement. He'll probably smack me for telling you this story, but I'll tell you this right now. Mike Orlowski, another one of our great guides. Mike and I have worked together since he's 16. Now he's in his mid-30s. Mike's one of the best fly anglers I know. And Mike does this thing sometimes on the Skeena where, especially if someone's having lunch, people having lunch, their flies out of the water. We're not going to find out anything if anything's swimming by. So Mikey will sometimes get people to hold the rod or just put in a rod hole or whatever, keep the fly in the water and set it out a little bit. So the fly is effectively stationary. Okay. It's got some movement from the current. You would be surprised how many times a fish comes and grabs that. So the fly doesn't always have to be moving fast to be effective, but it does need to be in the spot where the fish can get at it. And if your fly is pinned to your cork on the rod leaning up against a tree while you have a cup of coffee, you'll never know. So keeping your fly in the water is probably the single best thing an angler can do to increase their success.
Waters West Fly Fishing Outfitters is your gateway to the heart of Northwest fly fishing. Renowned for their expertise in spey casting and swung fly techniques, Waters West boasts an unmatched selection of fly tying materials and the knowledge to help you explore the region's most iconic rivers. I'll never forget that morning when Ed landed a steelhead just behind me, a perfect moment that reminds you why we chase chrome and why every day is a special one on the water. Whether you're a seasoned angler or swinging for the first time, Ed and Kyle are here to take your fishing expertise to the next level. You can visit Waters West Fly Fishing Outfitters right now and mention this podcast when you stop by. Join your community for both freshwater and saltwater fly fishing adventures. That's waterswest.com. No, I love the conversation with the spoons and the gear, because if you think about it, and Jeff, I'm sure you have a little experience on just the gear, right? Because you know, some of that, but spoon, and I fished a little bit of it, right? It's old school. In fact, my mom back in the day, so my dad was a steelhead guide on the Deschutes back in the, 50s. They used to ride a train. The train would literally drop them off on the Deschutes. They'd get off and fish it back before anybody was there, and and all that. But my mom was a big steelhead angler, like back in probably the 60s, the 70s and stuff like that. And she fished spoons. She didn't fish fly. She would be out there, and she probably caught more steelhead for sure than me, than probably most people. But the cool thing, and I fished a little bit, but the spoon's really unique, right? Because it does what you're saying. In the water, it kind of spins and does this thing. But if you hit a broken thing, it drops and flips and flops. And I think Brian, that's what you're talking about. And I think the fly, right? That's kind of what you don't want the fly just to be doing this, right? All the way swinging across, just the same thing, right? Steps, cast, step. You want it to be hit that bucket and do some different things. Is that what you guys are saying here?
Yeah, I think that, okay, so there's this thing where a lot of times someone's telling you a fish story. They're like, Dave, I just knew I was going to get one. I just knew it was going to happen. Well, how did you know that? Well, it's because you recognize the speed of the fly, right? It's familiar. You like the way the fly was moving. The line felt smooth. Weird things happen when you're steelheading. That's half the fun. You flop out a cast, you're talking to someone, a fish comes and grabs it. You're stripping it in fast because you didn't like the cast and you're going to cast again. Fish comes and chases it down on the surface. Adrienne, once again, she's got a great quote. It's actually in one of the promo movies that we've done in the spring here. Might be in the Sims one. I can't recall. She says, hey, every time you think you've seen everything about steelhead, they'll surprise you with something new. And it really is the case. I don't think these fish are hard to catch. I think that the hardship that one goes through, especially in the winter and especially in the latter part of the fall, where you got cold fingers and the water's cold and it's probably raining or snowing out. I think that mentality of a steelheader to keep going and to believe in what they're doing, that inherent optimism is probably the best quality of a successful steelheader. And you're going to have periods where you're not going to catch anything. Doesn't matter where you fish. Water's rising, the fish aren't there. Who knows, right? But to keep the fly moving and to try different things, like you said, Dave, different presentations. I'd rather change my presentation than my fly. And I will change flies from time to time, but, fish it slow, fish it fast, keep it close to the bottom, fish it on the surface. It all works. And it's really just a question of what you believe in and what you're willing to do consistently. And then, of course, not screwing it up when you get your chance. We haven't talked about trout setting. That's an important part.
Yeah.
You got those hair trigger reflexes from watching a bobber or bass fishing or whatever, and you need to lose that, because when a steelhead grabs your fly, when you're swinging it, you want the fish to grab the fly in turn. And the toughest one is when the fish grabs it on the dangle. By dangle, I mean when the fly is straight below you. If a fish grabs that and doesn't turn, it's probably going to come unbuttoned pretty quick. So, steelheading is like, okay, we're going to make all these casts, and we're not going to get a lot of positive feedback. We're not going to get a lot of bites. And all of a sudden something magical is going to happen. And you need to not screw it up by freaking out and moving your rod. And, I've talked about this a little bit on our show, asking various guides, what do you do when a fish grabs your fly? And I think my favorite answer, and by the way, Jeff, this gentleman told me to say hi to you, Dax Messett. been on in the bucket a couple times. Dax fishes with us every fall. And Dax's advice to people is, hey, you worked really hard for this moment. You made a lot of casts. Fish is eating your fly. Don't interrupt it. And it's definitely solid advice. Don't interrupt it. Let the fish eat. Let it take your fly. And yeah.
Don't do anything. What's your, Jeff? Is that your advice, or what are you telling your clients when you know they're going to get some action with the steelhead? What do you tell them?
Don't do nothing, but I'm going to steal a line from George Cook. I think that's chew the gum, right? I think that old time classic verbiage from George was like, it sort of rings the bell, just like they got to turn, like Brian said, right? And I will say a no drag click and paw is really good for the beginning of the whole fight, but then the second part can get a little tricky with a beginning angler. Everybody wants to have this cool reel, but there could be some real cans of whoop ass opened up.
God, have you seen that? Have you seen anybody get get spooled and just get worked with a click and paw reel?
Oh yeah, multiple times.
What's that sound like when you see the fish just going out of control and they're, what are they trying to do? Just to kind of palm the reel, or
they don't have no clue what to do because it's like insanity, right? It's just like you want like, especially where Brian's fish are. When you connect with one of them, it's on. Even the cohos or whatever, it's going to be on it. And then you're going to be like, well, that 100-foot of shooting line that I have is probably gone before you can even think about what to do next. So it's pretty cool. So I would say a drag reel, Brian, that'd be pretty interesting what you think about that system, like for a first time big fish encounter. Do you think the drag system reels are, stay away from your, your reels that you want to use, but what's your opinion on that?
Oh, that's a great question. I love that question. I've been asking that one a lot to people, and you get different answers. So first off, I'll say there's a group of guides out there who choose to fish click and paw reels on their personal time, but put disc drag reels in the hands of their clients for all the reasons that you just described. And then other folks, and I'm going to put myself in this category. I don't fish as much as I used to, Jeff. And I set myself up to have the best possible chance when I hook an exceptional fish. Doesn't happen all the time, but I don't want to lose a fish and wish that I had a stronger drag. And one of the challenges isn't the beginning. I'd love to have the click and paw at the beginning all the time, but it's finishing the deal, right? And being able to really cinch the reel down. And you can certainly control a fish with a click and paw, but my own personal reels right now are Islander TR3s, which is a sealed disc drag reel that's converted, designed for ocean fishing for large Chinook salmon, conventional tackle. We use them for spay rod fishing, 4.5 inches, I think, or 4.6 inches diameter. So big rate of retrieve, super strong drag, lots of capacity. I'm a big fan, I think, right now of disc drag reels, but I will set them really loose at the beginning. And that being said, obviously, I've got a Schamberg that I fish sometimes, and that's a gorgeous click and paw reel. But yeah, I tend to be a disc drag guy because I've seen it go sideways too often out here with exceptional fish. And that's the part that really sticks with you. We've talked about this before, I think, but you lose a fish without seeing it. Man, you don't forget that. If I'm going to lose a fish, I at least want to know what it was. But it sucks when, if a fish gets a long ways away from you and then comes unbuttoned and you're like, man, was that a 30 pounder or what the heck was that? And that's what keeps you coming back, I guess, so doesn't it?
Yeah. Dave, do you use gel spun backing like when you're steelhead fishing, or do you use the standard DAC rod, or what's your go-to?
I've always just used the standard.
Okay.
That's kind of what I've always done. So, I don't get too nerdy on any of that stuff. I'm not quite, you guys, I think, are in the know on all of that, a lot of that stuff, but, maybe describe that a little bit, maybe go into that just a hair on, because you do have this thing, the backing, which in a lot of trout fishing, you're out there, people aren't ever seeing the backing. It's not even seeing the light of day, right? It's just on your reel. But with steelhead, you do have a chance. So what would be if somebody's getting a reel put together or whatever, is that an important thing to be thinking about?
Yeah, first thing, if you're bringing up a reel that has backing on it, is make sure there's not a loop in it from like when you wind your reel up and the tippet gets in and you have that half hitch. It could be down in there and you're going to have the industrial accident happen on the Skeena. So first thing, if you're not at a shop and you're just going to use your old back and check it because you're going to need it. Second is going to be make sure you walk it out and get it on tight and you don't have any issues. Like it's cut down because, I love the, using 40, 50 pound gel spun, but it can cut down within itself, right? If you really get one buried like a really big fish, it can cut down within itself. But I fish a big enough gel spun that I've had some pretty long fights across boulders and stuff. I'm sort of glad I had it, if that makes sense, in a couple cases.
Yeah, gotcha. Cool. Let's jump into a little on the gear. Let's go, Jeff, to you and just start with that. The gear, Great Lakes. Talk about, maybe go into rod, line, kind of what typically somebody's using there, and then talk about how you transition over into your Skeena and what changes you make there.
Yeah, I think this is something that people don't realize how large the Great Lakes are. The diversity from my little runoff streams, Dave, that you've been on, we're only talking, 11 foot, 11 and a half foot switch rods, or even a single hander. You can swing flies, but there's multitudes of rivers that you need a full two hander on, right? So generally speaking, in my neck of the woods, a 5, 6, 7 weight switch rod gets the job done all the time. But if you start stepping into some of the larger rivers up in Michigan, the Muskegum, the Manistee, if I bump on over to the Niagara River, our equipment is going to cross over to what I bring to the Skeena. It's a payload delivery system, right? If I'm going to be throwing a little bit of T14, I'm not going to be throwing it on my switch rod. So I have to step up my game. But my go-to, and I have this thing about fish hook to land ratio. And I do a lot of like certain rods and the way I fish it, how much pressure you put on them, like how many do I land with that rod? And I feel a lot of times what works for me is I run around a 13 and a half foot, 7 or 8 weight, and I have very good success with it. I usually fish the 7 weight most of the time, but if I get into one of those days, because we never win the battle with Mother Nature. She's the house dealer, and we are going to have 2 days of wind. And when the wind comes, I'm going to step up from that 480 grain, and I'm going to drop right into a 560 head, because it's going to make it easier for me to cut into a wind that's cutting into my face at 25 miles an hour or something. So I sort of have a light rod and a heavy rod when I do the BC. And I do the same thing here, in the Great Lakes. I have a light switch rod and a heavy switch rod, because from my experience, a lot of times, no matter even on the Great Lakes, is that you want to have a shallow setup and a deep setup ready to go. So if I come to a greasy tail out, I'm not going to be throwing the logging chain. I'm going to come through there, floating through space. I can do a few mends to snake it in there. But then when I get into the right off the lip, like that time me and you were there where you had that fish right off the lip in that fast water, you needed a little heavier tip to get the fish to front. So it's a good idea to have 2 setups, if that makes sense.
Yeah, have 2. Okay. And then in the lines you're typically using for the Great Lakes, are you using those lines when you head over to the Skeena?
I'm a Skagit angler. It's not a Spey cast. It's a tactical 2-handed cast. I've had some really good mentors. I feel it's a very versatile line. If I was fishing dries all the time, I would not, but we're not going to be doing a lot of that in BC, and that doesn't come into my wheelhouse very little in the Great Lakes. So it's mostly Skagit. Very versatile.
Okay, and then over to you, Brian. I've heard this a few times about the Spey casting, Spey, the name Spey is out there, but I've heard people sometimes say Spey. No, maybe that's not the right word. What's your take on that, Brian? What are we doing? Do you use Spey out there a lot? Is that, and then describe your gear that you're using?
Yeah, I use Spey. That's how I describe it.
Yeah.
So the first person I guided for up here was Mike and Denise Maxwell, I should say. And, we'll say that was probably the early days of Spey casting in BC. Mike is credited with being one of the folks who really pushed this early on. But meanwhile, I would say most of the gear I personally fish is more in line with, what we'll call Skagit casting. But to me, the lines get pretty blurry. And I know this is perhaps controversial, but, my own personal fishing, I'm using Skagit lines, but touch and go anchor casts. So what am I doing? I'm doing the exact same thing I do with a long belly line, but obviously I've shortened the stroke and the gear scales down, as it would. So my own personal rod that I'll fish the most is a 12-foot 10, 8-9 on the Skeena. I throw a 575 grain line on there. A lot of our guests using that same rod will fish a 600 or a 625. But there's this thing where as you get better at casting, you can get away with a slightly lighter line, and there's some advantages to that from a feel standpoint. And, if I can, I'll fish a lighter rod too. I'll fish a 12-foot, it's kind of a light 8-weight, throws a 525 grain line, and that rod fishes better at a shorter distance. What you gain as you add rod length is the ability to fish better at a further distance, and what you lose is the ability to, be really connected on a short cast. Is there a scenario where a guy would fish an 11-foot switch rod or 11-foot short single-hander on the Skeena? You bet. Where they're going to struggle is if they find themselves in a spot where they want to fish a really, really long cast. But when it comes to playing fish, you can land the fish of your dreams on a 7-weight. You can do just as good a job beating that fish up with a 7-weight as you can with a 10 if you pull hard and you're using appropriate size line and you've got, a reel that's up to the task. So I think when it comes to the rod size, it probably has more to do with the cast than the fish you're trying to catch. And I forget exactly how you said it, Jeff. I think you said payload delivery system. Boom. That's it right there, right? It's if you're fishing a Skagit head, you're going to have the capability to fish some bigger flies, some heavier sink tips if needed. If I want to fish a dry fly or something wispy just underneath the surface, I want more front taper on the line and I want less weight between me and the fly. And I don't need that much weight to deliver that payload to the fish. So rods for the Skeena. If I've got 3 rods in the boat, and yeah, I know that sounds silly, but yeah, I'll do that. I'm going to have one of them set up, like I said, 12-foot 10 with a Skagit head, probably 5 and 5 T11, maybe 5 and 5 T14. Why not? I'm going to have another one set up 12-foot with a short Skagit, so like a 20-foot Skagit line. And, surprise, surprise, I might have that with, say, T14, but a shorter sink tip. So it'll still be a Mo tip. We use Mo tips a lot. But it might only be 2.5 feet of sink. And I'm going to use that in close around big rocks. And I'm going to feel like I'm really connected to what the fly is doing, fishing it close to the bottom, close to shore. And then that third rod is probably going to have a dry line on it. And if it doesn't have a dry fly on it, it's going to have something not too far from the surface anyways. And if I was really going to be silly and have a fourth rod in the boat, it would be a 14 or a 15-foot rod with probably like a type 6 sink tip, a longer sink tip, more uniform, not so much a Mo tip with the short sinking section. And that is a real specialty item. And I'm going to pull that thing out in a big, long flat where I have uniform depth. And I want to throw it as far as I can because I know that 130, 140 feet out from where I'm standing, it's still only 3.5 feet of depth. And it's a good speed and the fish like to sit there. So this is the advantage of using the boat on the Skeena and having lots of space. You can bring all the gear. A little different if you're hiking the bank, but I won't call it a quick overview because I was kind of long-winded there. But that's a lot of information about what I'm going to fish.
That's a great overview. As you were talking, for some reason I just popped, and maybe it's because I've been listening to your episodes with all the guys. But can you fish out of a boat in the Skeena? Like, are there gear guys pulling plugs and stuff like that out there?
When Chinook salmon was open, or for our American friends, king salmon, when there was a targeted Chinook fishery, boat fishing with plugs was really popular. And sure, you could fish that way for steelhead. I just don't see anybody doing it.
Right. Because I mean, again, if you look at the Deschutes, my home river, there's have been lots of gear guys fishing for steelhead with all sorts of gear, whether that's plugs, like we said, the side planers. Have you ever seen a side planer, right? That's this thing where it basically takes your thing out in the middle of the river, your lure, and then it sits right in the middle of the run, right? And just feeds them right down, right? Those things are killers. But yeah.
I'll tell you, Dave, the scenario where we sometimes will fish someone out of the boat looks like this. We get someone who showed up who's overestimated their wading ability. Perhaps it's an older person and they just want to fish, but they don't want to have to deal with casting and stepping. And in that situation, we'll anchor the boat in 2.5 feet of water and either trail the line out behind and get them to, do a double spey or something off the back end there comfortably. We don't do that all the time, but occasionally it happens. And that's the scenario where we would fish from the boat. I can't think of an instance where we've ever anchored the boat to get on top of fish that we couldn't reach from shore. And part of that is the fact that the steelhead of the Skeena are typically caught disappointingly close to shore, pretty like really, really close to the bank. So except for in that spot I kind of identified earlier where you have these big flats that are kind of uniform in depth, or maybe it's a really long diagonal bar that extends quite a ways out. Those are special spots, and they don't tend to come into play until the water gets quite low.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to get a couple more tips out of you, then we'll start to take it out of here. But I was thinking about this earlier, which is a big struggle for people, especially on new rivers, finding the fish, right? I think you guys have talked about a little bit about finding that water, but somebody comes in, maybe they're not on this guide trip, but they're on the Skeena fishing the main stem or some big water. What's your tip? Maybe Jeff, let's start with you to help find, how are they finding those fish? What are you telling somebody?
You know, the river gives up its secrets when you look upriver. When you're looking downriver, it all looks the same. But if you look at a river, it's like a conveyor belt and a bunch of escalators, right? And like Brian said, you know, you're probably not paying attention, but pay good attention when one of the guides and you're moving downriver, look up where they were fishing, and you will literally see this little flat spot where they park before they go upstream. So it gives away its secrets is when you look upriver for sure. All those little nooks and crannies and those little resting spots, right? And it's more obvious, of course, on a smaller river, but the Skeena has the same thing, right?
Yep. How about you, Brian? What would you be telling somebody who's new to the Skeena and it's their first time there and they don't know where to start and they just jump into a big on the river?
Well, that's a great tip, by the way. You know, being able to look upstream, because you will see things a lot differently than just working your way down. When you're working your way down, you're really relying on, you know, how your line feels going through it. And a lot of times it's too late by the time you realize you fished through the best part of the run. So when you have the opportunity to walk up and look at it, I think that's fantastic. You know, we're looking for the spot within the spot. And when you're on a steelhead river anywhere, there's 3 criteria that are really important. One is structure. And structure can be many things. Could be salmon reds, could be woody debris, could be big rocks, typically big rocks. The second is speed and depth, and they tend to correlate. You know, you find water that's 2.5, 3 feet deep, it's probably going to look pretty good. The third one is location on the river. And there's certain things that will increase the value of the real estate. Above a rapid, below a rapid, tributaries, big bends, things like that. Anything that's interesting and different tends to cause the fish to want to hang out. Now, on the Skeena, we have this fourth thing, and that is lane of travel. And that's really important. If you're fishing out from where the fish are traveling, doesn't matter how good your flies are or how good your cast is, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of action. Fishing around the fish is important. So that comes in the whole wade shallow, cast short thing. But with that all being said, when you're looking at the water saying, okay, well, where do I want to spend my time? You want to look for the changes where the river goes from too fast to slower. Now, this is kind of visual, but I'm going to go for it anyway, see how we do. One of the things I always say to clients is imagine you're up in the air looking down at this piece of water we're about to fish. And everything that's too fast, like that stuff we're looking at out there in the middle, that's the color red. And everything that's too slow, like this stuff here that's not even moving, that's blue. And we want to find the purple. Okay, so now we're looking for the purple. The purple's the right speed. But now I want to find areas where purple goes from wide to narrow, essentially forming a triangle, if that makes sense to you guys, because those are pinch points and we want to fish to those points. So basically, when you're trying to figure out where you want to fish on a big river like the Skeena, where the fish are moving and it all looks pretty good and it's a little bit overwhelming, you know, the river, like you said, the river gives up its secrets. You know, you look at the bank, you see a point, you see a little bay. One piece of folklore you hear around here that's kind of funny is people say, oh, a lot of times if you find a log on the bank, that's a really good spot in the run to catch a fish. We call those guide logs, right? It's kind of a joke that, you know, the guide will sit on the log watching a fish and they get one in front of him. Well, why is that log there? Well, that log eddied out there for a reason. And that was because there's just a little bit more depth there. There was a reason that log stopped moving there and ended up on the bank. And that transitions out to the water that you're fishing. And obviously, you know, the river height from the beginning of the season to the end changes quite a bit. But this idea of looking for the features is really, really key. And some of them are obvious. It's a big rock that you can't miss, but a lot of them are more subtle. And watching the foam as it drifts down the river will be time well spent. And once again, there's no substitute for time on the water. And hiring a guide is a bit of a shortcut, no doubt. And if you're a person who's spending money to go on a guided trip and you're smart, you're going to ask a lot of questions. You're going to tell the guide, regardless of whether it's a trip with us or someone else, you're going to tell the guide at the beginning, hey, I'm humble. I want to learn. This is why I'm here. And guides love to hear that. There's nothing that a fishing guide loves more than to give advice and feel that that advice is being listened to. It's probably a character flaw, but I think that's a big thing that draws people to the job.
That's well put. And I've heard those stories before too. Some of those, maybe that was on your show, Brian, where you've had, I think, a couple of times where you got those clients that aren't listening, right? They think that they've done this, right? They've been steelhead fishing for 20 years. They know it all and they're not listening to the guide. Like that's probably not a good thing to be doing, right? Even if you have a lot of experience.
Yeah. The yeah guy.
Yeah, right. I mean, I can't imagine that because I haven't been guided. I mean, I've been guided more in the last 3-4 years, with you guys and all this stuff we've been doing with our everything on the travel than I ever have in my life. Because I was kind of a guide. I was a bad guide back in the day, and I didn't like it, and for a number of reasons, the pressure and stuff. I mean, that's the thing that I did to myself, right? I put a lot of pressure on myself as a guide. I was like, oh my God, if they get skunked, it's the end of the world, and I really had bad days, right, when that stuff happened. But that's expectations, right? That's always the expectation. So maybe I'm trying to take this out of here, you guys. It's hard because we've got so much. I got this two of the best steelhead anglers I can imagine in front of me, but what are the expectations? So somebody, again, they're going to be on this trip. What are you telling them? Brian, let's start with you. What are the expectations? How are you making sure they know what to expect going into this thing?
Regardless of whether it's this trip or another, when someone reaches out to me and says, hey, I'm interested in coming to your lodge, I really put a lot of effort into making sure that they understand that steelheading's hard. And you can do certain things to increase your odds. But at the end of the day, sometimes we just don't catch fish. It is what it is. And you just want to feel at the end of the day that you fished hard and you didn't catch fish because there wasn't a fish there. I said that earlier. So what I explain to folks is the day. This is when we have breakfast. This is when we go out. So we do breakfast at 7. We hit the water at 8. We fish hard till 5. We do dinner at 7. That's the day. And it has a real nice flow to it. You come back at the end of the day, you hang out with your buddies, tell some fish stories, have a wonderful meal, and, the anticipation of doing it all again the next day. But, when it comes to steelhead fishing, life's just one big giant fishing trip. And the fish you catch, on this week or that week or whenever you're fishing, that's only part of the story. A big part of what happens in that same time period is the knowledge you gain and the confidence you gain that you can then take forward into other fishing trips. And, you will find that, you guys know this, there's certain people that are just fishy. There's some people that are really great casters, but there's some people that are just fishy. Doesn't matter where you put them. If there's fish to be caught, they're going to be in the mix. And those people just have this real kind of sense of calm about them. It's almost like they let the fish find them. But, I said this on a couple of episodes. It's a common thing for me to bring this up, but because it fascinates me, and that's I got to get a fish guy never gets a fish. You have two clients. One of them's like catching fish places you've never seen a fish caught before. The other guy's like, I need a fish. That guy never gets them, but the chill guy always seems to get them, or the chill gal. I don't know what it is. It's like negative vibes going down the line or what it is. Who knows? But it's wild and it's real.
That's a good advice for a steelhead angler coming in, is like, chill out. Don't get too stressed. Relax. And especially on this trip, because they're going to be guided by some great guides. And Jeff, you're going to be there as well. I want to leave as we go out here. We're on a podcast, so I got to ask you guys a couple of podcast questions. So Jeff, you've got the Great Lakes Dude podcast you've been doing. Talk about that. You've done a number of episodes there. What is it about the podcast that you really like?
It's the opportunity to, just like Brian said, is like you, Dave. You listen, and you have to sometimes go back even yourself, because there's so much good information that someone's going to, basically, they're intimate with their waters, right? It could be a biologist. It could be a guide. They are seriously intimate with their watershed. And just, if I attend a seminar, if I get one nugget, that was worth me sitting there for an hour and a half. One nugget. And you get multiple nuggets from a podcast. Brian's your last one, with the biologist. It just, all those little nuggets, there were so many, I had to listen to it 2 or 3 times to take notes, right? So I think that's it. And then also relating, I like Dave when sometimes, because, I'm obsessed with fishing, is when they confirm that I'm sort of like, because we don't know each other, right?
Yeah.
It's like if Brian says something, that's like, boy, he just sort of confirmed what I think too. So it's like gives us, validity of like, oh, maybe I'm doing this right, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't know, you know.
Right. Exactly. Nice. That's good. And how about you, Brian? You've been, I think you're 12 episodes in. We got, or maybe a little more now, but it feels like you're into it too, pretty good. Are we going to keep this going on your side?
I'm liking it. And, 12 episodes, that's just a baby in this whole deal. I think for me, it's the opportunity to have conversations with people that you would normally have anyways. And like you said, those nuggets, the knowledge. I go back to one of the earliest episodes I did with a guy named Trevor Kovich, who's an Alaskan fishing guide, also works down in Forks. And Trevor is he's a very serious fishing guide. And he's a guy that if there's going to be a fish caught, it's going to be him or his client. Trevor's an incredibly competent fishing guide. And I paired him up for this discussion with a guy that he'd never met before. I don't do that too often, but I was like, hey, I think these guys are going to get along good, and let's just put them on the screen together and see where it goes. And that's a gentleman actually kind of from your neck of the woods, Jeff, called Alex Belanger. And Alex is an old friend of mine. He lives in Michigan and super enthusiastic Chinook salmon angler and incredible fly tire. I still think he's got some of the best color combinations I've ever seen. But, the thing about Alex is his day job, his regular job is they have a nursery. They grow plants and, they put the flowers together, make them look pretty. So he understands building flies to not overdo it, which is something that happens a lot, right? He understands that it's the subtlety, it's the negative space that you leave. So his flies are absolutely gorgeous. But that podcast, Trevor drops serious wisdom, but it's mixed in there with some really interesting, fun anecdotes. And that's podcasting, right? That's podcasting is you got to listen to 2 hours and there's going to be like 2 or 3 things in there that you're going to keep and carry on with you. And I just personally, I just love that part of it.
Part of this trip is we always try to do this. I think, Jeff, when we were heading to the Great Lakes, we did this, but we're always trying to find a conservation partner to help because obviously these are the groups that are, for the most part, helping, do great things in the basin and stuff. So Brian, tell me about the conservation group and the episode that you have.
Yeah. So our partner in this promotion is the Conservation Angler, and that's headed up by John McMillan, who is a guy I have just a ton of respect for. And the cool thing with John is, he's a scientist, but he's also a passionate steelhead angler and a lifelong steelhead angler. So John is a guy that loves to fish and he's just curious by nature. And I think when you can combine the knowledge that one gains as an angler with the knowledge that one gains as being a scientist and just the network of folks that a guy like that has around him, this is a guy who knows more about steelhead than anyone almost. And I'll tell you guys, one of the neat things, we've referred to this episode a few times, but one of the neat things about putting together that one with Bob Hooton and Brian Morrison and John was the email chain leading up to the show. And, those guys would be like, oh, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And then they'd send out some papers and, we'd go back and we'd read it and I'd keep my mouth shut because I was in deep water there, letting them do their thing. And man, I learned so much. And what I also learned is there's so much that we don't know. And John touched on the pink salmon issue quite a bit.
Oh, yeah.
In that episode, you can sense that, him and Bob might have slightly different views on this, but they're not arguing with each other. They're kind of supporting each other's ideas and saying, but what if it's this? What if it's that? And if you look at it this way, and I think, man, that is exactly the same type of conversation my friends that just love to fish have about their big theories about what shade of blue is going to work best today and what sink tip they should be using. And, I love that about fishing, and I'm looking forward to getting John back on the show. And John's going to be joined by Tom Perro, who's also a big part of that organization. And I'm looking forward to learning more about what they're doing and also, the direction they're heading in the future. I personally have been kind of critical of a lot of NGOs because I feel that in a lot of cases, they're moving away from being angler-based organizations. But the cool thing with TCA, the conservation angler, is I see them going the other direction. I see them really moving towards basically a conservation group for people that love to fish. And, it's the curiosity side of science that I think draws us into steelhead fishing, right? We want to learn more. Why did I catch a fish today? Why were they sitting beside that rock today like that? Wasn't that neat how we found those fish in that spot? Yeah. I said it before. It's probably like the same degenerative gene that causes people to sit in front of a slot machine for hours on end, hoping their luck's going to change. But that's steelheading, man. Out we go, and let's see what happens. And we'll do it again tomorrow if we can. Why not?
That's it. Perfect. And I'll give a shout out to the Deep Wade podcast, because that's John's new podcast, which is amazing, right? So he's back out doing it, and we'll put a link in the show notes to that one.
I want to shout out one episode there. It's an old one from a previous podcast he had. I listened to it the other day, and it's with Bill Herzog. And Bill Herzog is an OG steelhead angler. He's not an uppity fly guy. He's done it all. He's caught steelhead with all types of tackle. And go find that episode and listen to it. It's pure podcast gold.
Yep.
The conversation those two guys had.
That is a great episode. Awesome, guys. Well, Jeff, anything else you want to leave it with before we get out of here? This has been great. As we think about this trip, right around the corner, what do you want to leave folks, here as we head out of here?
I don't think you could pick a better trip to join Brian, myself, and his guides. So I'm really looking forward to this. We're going to have a great time. We're going to learn a ton. I'm going to learn a ton. So I think it's going to be way cool.
Awesome. Well, and we'll just let everybody know right now, we obviously have the giveaways going on, so people can enter that. There'll be links. But also, if folks want to just get some of the spots here, they can reach out to me, Dave at wetflyswing.com. Jeff, why don't you let people know that don't know you? I think a lot of people do know you, but where can they find you?
They could just go to Great Lakes Fly Fishing, or just Google up Great Lakes Dude. They'll find me somehow. My phone number's out there. Email is just my name at jeffliskay@gmail.com.
Awesome. And are we going to have some more episodes coming from you hosting in the future?
Oh, absolutely. Would love to do it. I really enjoy hosting because I get to meet great steelhead anglers from all over, just not the Great Lakes. I think it's really cool. And I learn from them. That's one thing I realize, that I learn sometimes more from my clients than I teach them. It's really pretty cool.
Yeah, nice. And Brian, how about you? Where can people find you?
Easiest way to get a hold of me is send an email to info@skeenaspey.com.
Perfect. All right, guys. Well, thanks for the great episode. Really excited about this trip, and I know we're going to put together a great one this year. Thanks for all the time.
Great, man. Thanks for the invite, Dave.
Thanks, Dave. And nice to see you on here, Jeff. Thank you. Look forward to having you at the lodge.
Yeah, way cool.
Call to action is very clear today. If you want to join the Skeena Spey School this year and you want to get in on this action, you can check in with me, Dave at wetflyswing.com. You can also check in with the podcast we mentioned, the In the Bucket podcast, the Great Lakes Dude podcast. We've got both of these going strong. So if you're interested in this trip, you can get in on that. And if you want to check on the giveaway, that's going right now as well. You can join the giveaway, wetflyswing.com/giveaway. Enter for your chance to win all expenses paid trip to the Skeena School this year and all the gear. All right, I got to get out of here. It's getting late into the evening. Hope you have a wonderful evening. Hope you have a spectacular morning or a very good afternoon. And I'll check you on that next episode. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.